Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching this Monday night in-depth ag forecast brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. Well, the first thing I want to start you off with is one of my favorite websites. It's called worldview.earthdata.nasa.gov. And when you get there, you can see some of our high-resolution, low Earth orbiting satellite data. I've chosen MODIS, which is on board the platform called EOS Aqua. And what I'm really interested in was seeing what was going on in the plains as that large storm system emerged on Sunday. As we just kind of zoom in here with some of the high-resolution satellite imagery, you can see just the tremendous amount of dust that was being blown around, the very strong winds around that low. And we can even see some of the field fires. This one right here is in parts of southern Nebraska. But there were multiple fires, of course, started by this, and a lot of debris from the field from harvest getting tossed around, plus this just truly large dust storm out ahead of this. Now, in addition to this, on the back side, as the system went through, you can kind of see all the cloud cover here around the low. It did put down quite a bit of snow. And just looking through this morning at the weekend total snowfall amounts, not only did we get some higher amounts that got into the Rocky Mountains here, but also out into parts of Montana and Wyoming. But that was quite interesting to see this snow here today, because all day long behind that low, which is now just north of Lake Winnipeg, we've had some very strong winds out of the west. And winds out of the west that come off the Rocky Mountains are downslope winds, and they compressionally warm. So it's been very windy. There's been red flag warnings posted throughout parts of the plains. And we're not only watching this main front here slowly make its way toward the eastern Corn Belt all the way down to the lower Mississippi River Valley, but the second system that's turning up behind it right here in parts of Texas. More on that in just a few seconds. But can you see the stronger winds? Let's just kind of zoom in here, coming down off the mountains and rolling out into parts of Montana. And why I'm bringing this up is because, take a look at this. The temperatures coming off the mountains today, about 4 o'clock when I'm recording this, were quite warm, considering that just recently there was quite a bit of snow there. That's the effect of the downslope winds. And on satellite, you can really see the implications of this. Now, I'm going to take you back to this morning, right as the sun was rising. Whoops, got a new image there. There we go. Let's go back. Now, do you see, look at the area that's in white under the cloud cover. And as I play forward with this, you can see that the snow is melting. See that? If I go back versus this morning, keep your eye right here, and then go forward, you can see the snow melting throughout the day. And again, that's simply a consequence of the downslope compressional warming of those winds, melting a lot of that snow. So that's water that's going to get into the soil. Now, here's the main frontal boundary. Been watching that all day. And here's the system coming behind it. And that's the one that's going to run right up here along this boundary, delivering a lot of rain to parts of the Mid-South, parts of the Southern Plains, and then getting here into the Central and Eastern Corn Belt. And why we're keeping such a close eye on the systems entering the Northwest, the ones coming across the midsection of the country, is because of what we talked about last week. And that is our newest drought monitor here shows us the greatest extent of land area in the lower 48 with drought. And again, that number is looking at 82% of the land area. So we've got a lot of work to do in terms of the jet stream's ability to redirect moisture over the next 4 to 6 months to see this drought picture shrink. And that's going to be a main focus of mine, is going to be watching the drought change this winter. And I'm going to present to you today kind of my latest thoughts on that. So much of our discussion as of late has been really around the Mississippi watershed. We take a look at the soil moisture data from early this morning. So this does not yet include all of the recent rain that happened today in this area. This was from this morning. And so you can still see the extensive dryness in and throughout the Mississippi watershed. From there, just want to give you some stats again. I just love looking at these maps. This is from September 1, and we're looking all the way through 7 a.m. this morning at precipitation ranks by climate district. And it just kind of shows that the pattern, which was all blocked up over the west, delivered a lot of convergent flow in the jet stream. That's where we just produce a lot of high pressure, and that just shut down the Gulf of Mexico moisture transport, that shut down the frequency of fronts, and it's only been in the last 3 days that this whole pattern has started to break down. Now, I will be focused on this central United States drought, but to understand how it will change, the change will happen first in the west. And I just want to bring you up to speed on the current reservoir levels now that we've just begun a new water year. The water year in the west goes from October to October, and what's important is just to know where we start. And you can see all the different reservoir levels across California, but the ones I tend to focus on are the big ones up north, like Lake Shasta and Lake Oroville. And when we just see these large reservoirs, just for perspective, Shasta, when full, is almost a 4,500 acre foot reservoir. It's huge. and right now it's at 32%. Same with Lake Oroville. So we're going to watch these reservoir levels very carefully. Now, they started off low this year, but who didn't start off low was the Pacific Northwest. And I'm taking you here to the hydromet data to look at what we call the teacup diagrams. Now, the Northwest started off with great snowpack and good winter moisture, and they just essentially used all of it throughout the end of the season due to a very hot and dry finish to the season. So if we come in here and look at Yakima and surrounding area, you can see some of the storage reservoirs are quite low, like Cle Elum is looking at 30%, and several of these are in that 30 to 40% range. You can then come down like to eastern Oregon, and this is where things are really looking rough. Some of the big reservoirs here are empty right now, and some of them are just less than 10% full. This is an area where drought has plagued the region for much of the year. In the Snake River Valley, we see a similar thing. So what's important about what I'm about to discuss with you is we need the wet season to come on and stay on. If we're just thinking fully about the water health of the United States, we need the wet season to come on and stay on for the West and see how that progresses across the middle part of the country. So this is brand new data, just released about 30 minutes ago. It shows you the new outlook from November 4th to December 4th. And what's important about this update is that it really did not change too much from our analysis last week. That's good. I like the consistency. The jet stream is set up and well positioned to deliver frequent systems through the Northwest, but there's even some better evidence that we could get some of these coming into California, adding a lot of precipitation and moisture to the northern Sierra and getting here to the coastal ranges like the Klamath Mountains in Northern California. With a pattern of systems entering into the Pacific Northwest, they tend to redevelop once you get over the mountains and then quickly pull toward the north and east. But that's why we see a pretty sharp boundary into this area where we expect things to be wetter than normal and drier. So implications of this forecast should it verify. And while I have confidence in it, there's always failure points, okay? But should it verify, this will start to return water to the Mississippi River. It's going to take a very long time to bring the water levels up. Like we talked about last week, we could be looking at least a 6 to 8 week time period for recovery back to where we're not having to dredge everything all the time to get stuff to move. But the drier conditions you see from eastern Texas over to the Carolinas and the mid-Atlantic, this is simply due to the forecast trajectory of storm systems rolling through the country with a more northerly track. There tends to be more favorable ridging in this area in the forecast, and as a result, we just get a slight drier bias. I want to be clear, this does not mean this area is going to be dry, nor does it even really mean that this area is going to start to sink into drought. It just means it's got a drier bias in the forecast right now. So the big things to be watching from now all the way through next April is going to be these maps. And I've given you this kind of northern hemisphere but full west to east view of the jet stream. It will be very important to watch the extensions of the jet stream coming off of Asia into the Pacific and what happens right here in the Gulf of Alaska. Now, what we have to watch out for this entire cold season is to see if we can continue to have flow that stays unblocked. And what I mean by that is it moves more west to east than north to south. The second component of this is if we can get better flow from Hawaii into California. And that only tends to happen when there is not a La Niña. So we're going to come back to that in a second. But at this point, looking over the next 10 days, we do not see blocking reestablishing itself in the Gulf of Alaska. And that's critical to keeping the moisture there and flowing and coming into the west. And remember, as systems enter the west, they get reinvigorated as they go over the Rocky Mountains, develop what we call Lee cyclogenesis, and that kicks off storm systems that tap into Gulf moisture. We need these systems to be routine. Unfortunately, it does close up harvest windows and starts to close up, or tighten up, I should say, file application, because you tend to get about a system a week with this particular setup. But what's really key to all of this is that we need to see some fluctuation in the La Niña happening at some point. And to piggyback off of what I talked about last week, the key indicator for me that this La Niña will likely not fully commit to a third year, in other words, it just won't be around for the entire third year, is right here. Along the equator, we have seen a major increase in westward momentum. And a lot of this is happening in the top of the troposphere and in the stratosphere. And you're saying, well, why does that matter? Well, that matters because that tells me that the global momentum is shifting back to a westward propagating setup. So that is the opposite of La Niña. And this is my first clue that La Niña is not going to just be there permanently throughout our entire winter. We're going to watch this very carefully. There's more to that story. La Niña right now still has a control over this. As we talk about, these blue-greens coming across this area, that is just where we've got the strong trades. And where the reds exist here, that's where our strong westerly wind bursts. So even though we're starting to see the change happen, it's a slow process. So La Niña is still going to have control over the processes probably for the next 4 to 6 weeks. That means a lot of MJO in phases 5, 6, and 7, probably more in phases 6 and 7 going forward. Now, why we care about that is that this time of year, when the MJO is in that phase, it tends to give us more of this. What is it? It's the jet stream coming off of Japan and pushing quickly without any major blocks across the North Pacific. We want to just see a lot of this. And if the MJO is forecast to stay in that vicinity, that means that we tend to get in MJO Phase 7 more troughs of low pressure here. It's always around the base of the trough that we keep the momentum going. That's Phase 7. What about Phase 6? There it is again. So this just sets us up with the Pacific Jet that sends systems across the United States. What happens to them once they get over here in the North Atlantic will be critical for the East Coast and Europe's temperature pattern as we go into winter. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment as well. But as it stands, La Niña, you can see the symptom of it here in the trade winds, is still very much a dominant feature. Now, with all the warm water still in the North Atlantic, we just talk about Europe for a moment. With all that warm water in the North Atlantic, this is going to be critical to watch the change in, because it could give us an early symptom that Europe could go away from where they are right now, which is very warm conditions. I mean, look at this 5-day sliding window of temperatures through the beginning of November for much of Europe. It is very, very warm at this point. The changeover in these ocean temperatures historically to colder would represent greater risk of North Atlantic blocking. And as we look out there longer term, well, we don't see that happening for much of November. In other words, long duration cold right now is not in the forecast for fall for Europe. But our question is, will it be there for winter? And the concern about this primarily is over energy demand and how that has a major impact on what we do in agriculture, especially through natural gas. So I just went out and looked, and I'm going to present something to you today. I used the reanalysis data from the European model. It's called ERA5. Looked at the surface temperatures for January and February across Europe. So it's this entire area. And what I did was I plucked off these colder winters, January and February. And when we did that, this is what we found. Now, this is the trade wind pattern. That's what I want you to focus on. Now, notice this. The blues represent those strong easterly wind bursts. Currently, they're way over here. They're not there in the event that Europe has a cold winter, which means La Niña must let go in order for Europe to have a better chance this year of transitioning cold. If La Niña continues, there's a better chance that Europe does not see the long duration cold. Doesn't mean they can't, but there's a better chance they won't. Does that make sense? So we're going to watch that carefully. There's another component to this, and this is just a little bit different view. Blocking over Iceland is critical to getting cold air into Europe. Big ridges of high pressure that are between Iceland and Greenland make it cold in the eastern part of North America, and in Europe. We call that the negative phase of the North Atlantic Oscillation. Now, predicting that on long timescales is very difficult. It's a sub-seasonal weather feature. In other words, it changes on the timescale of days to weeks, not months. So this will be critical to watch while that in the polar vortex. And it's too early in the year to have a functional discussion about either the polar vortex or what the North Atlantic is going to set up in. But I'll tell you, to get the waters to cool off here is one of the first ingredients we'll be watching. Now, what I'd like to show you is the latest update from the Columbia University's IRI multi-model probability forecast. And I just would like to point out that currently their forecast for January, February, and March across Europe is not favoring the very warm bias that some other models are. So you don't see lots of reds all over the place. So what we need to just be prepared for here is the fact that there is still the chance that Europe could have a cold winter. And that would be probably synonymous with the East Coast of the United States seeing something like that as well. Okay? Now from here, I want to point out that one of the key things that must happen, which we've been discussing, is that those ocean temperatures in the middle of the Pacific need to start to warm. And the only way they'll warm is if the trade winds let go. And currently we do see the latest update from the CFSV2, that's a model run by NOAA, that the La Nina will likely be less of a factor past the beginning of the new year. And I'll just go back to one statement that I keep saying all the time. The indicator will be in the trade winds first. When they let go, we'll start watching for change. Now, since we've been kind of hinting at the United States, I want to come back to something we touched on Thursday. It's the winter outlook from NOAA. And as I said last Thursday, they are very clear that the current dominant driver is La Nina. And given that information and knowing the duration of La Ninas, we just tend to say that we'll probably get a La Nina look to winter. But they're also as clear as I am that the chances of La Nina fading midwinter are there, meaning that there's a high failure rate that the end of winter will not look like this when we sum it all up, December, January, and February. There's a better chance that we start off with significant cold intrusions that come into the north. But what I'll be watching for most carefully is this. Because right now, sure, wetter here and wetter there, we're already seeing that now being forecast through November and early December with drier risks here. But if we develop not only the polar branch of the jet stream, which we're seeing now, which comes in like this and exits here, but some sense of a subtropical jet or even a polar jet that's able to dive farther to the south and come out of Arizona, New Mexico, if either of those events happens, the risk of continued drought development from California into the Central Plains is diminished. Same thing over here in the southeast. So the number one thing we have to look out for, and we just got a perspective on drought at the beginning of this video, is to see the polar jet remain unblocked and the development of a subtropical jet to come in. Those are the two things that are most critical going forward because everything else sets up east of that. So we'll keep watching that in each video. Now, let's get back to the near-term forecast here before I talk about South America and wrap this one up. We do have two systems that are right now moving across the U.S. The first system, which earlier today was over North Dakota, is moving through Manitoba into Ontario. And it's leaving a long front right in through this area. There's a second low, an upper level low that's here, that's going to ride along that front. And the net effect of that is to really deliver a lot of heavy rainfall in this area. Chances right along through here of picking up 1 to 3 inches with the rain that's already fallen plus what's coming is high. What I'm concerned about is how far to the west the moisture makes it. Parts of Colorado, getting into Nebraska, South Dakota, and Kansas, which are very dry and need this winter moisture, early winter moisture, or fall moisture, are not seeming to get it. More systems are entering the northwest. You can see the heavy precipitation here, and we got to talk about a system that might come into California as well. But right now, since this morning, this is just the first. This is the moisture lining up on the front from this system, which spread some snow in parts of North Dakota today. This is the second system. You see it coming out of New Mexico into Texas that we're watching. The third one is here, coming into parts of the Pacific Northwest. More on that in a second. And I just can't leave off the fact that we have this coastal feature that's spreading rain throughout parts of New England today. So already through 4 o'clock, we've seen this moisture spread through today. You can see a pretty hard dividing line right in through here into who got it in Kansas and who didn't. And this is where moisture is desperately needed. As we go forward with this, later on tonight, we're going to be watching out for the risk of severe storms here in Texas, getting over into parts of Arkansas, Louisiana, and clipping parts of Oklahoma. But then in the overnight hours and then into tomorrow, this is going to translate farther to the east. That's where the Storm Prediction Center is keeping an eye on things. So let me take you straight to the high-res NAM model. Let's back this up here. It started about 7 o'clock tonight. So here's the second wave. Here's the lead front. As we play this forward, you see that line right through there? This is the one we're watching overnight tonight for the potential for some strong straight line winds and maybe some embedded hail. We then see that system riding along the tail end of that front. See it stretch through there? And it starts to spread that rain through Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, and eventually into Illinois. We'll watch tomorrow, once this gets over the river, for the risk of stronger storms here. But it's a very pencil-thin line currently being predicted by the models. So this rain spreads throughout Illinois into Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, eventually into southern Wisconsin and Michigan throughout the rest of the day on Tuesday. And then it works its way over into, southeastern Ontario and eventually into parts of New England. And behind that, we've got a shot of colder air that's coming through. Now, we got to see where the European picks up with this. So we've already played out to about here. So that's when the first system's out. Now let's keep an eye on what's going on behind it. Snow coming into the Rockies here. And what we're going to see is that low is going to try to dig through Colorado into New Mexico, and it's going to stay pretty far to the south. It's going to set up right here kind of in this Arklatex region, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. But this one is not expected to really ride north. Watch. As we go through the weekend, it just tends to stay pretty far to the south, and that's primarily because of the position of this high. If this high were here, this system would have gone straight up through Illinois, straight toward the Great Lakes, and been quite impactful. But take a look at what's happening on the West Coast by the time we get into the weekend. This is Sunday night, getting into Monday morning. The models have been flirting with developing a system that's currently a very small shortwave over China, but it's developing this system possibly early next week that could dive into California. And if it does do that, the current run does not resolve it, just so you know. If it does do that, it'd be a lot of rain and snow for parts of Northern California. As of late, the newest update tries to bring it more into the Pacific Northwest for early next week. But that's a lot of systems coming into the Northwest over the next 10 days or so. So if I look out over the next week here, this is just the next 7 days. This is total accumulated precipitation. But you can see more is getting added into the Northwest as we just stretch this out all the way to the 3rd of November. The models right now have an interesting setup with this next two systems coming into the south. The European, which is wetter compared to the GFS in these colors. The GFS is wetter here. Look how much wetter of a model overall the European is. And that's all about the phasing of these next couple of waves. So let's watch that carefully. Long story short, though, what got us set up doesn't seem to really let go as we go now into that first full week of November. And it's more troughs entering into the Pacific Northwest. So this is November the 3rd, 10 days from now. And what do we see going out there into the first full week? More West Coast or Western North America troughing events and ridging here. And that was the setup we started with at the beginning. So the week 2 precipitation pattern continues to bring more moisture into the west. Systems tend to eject in the plains, and that's why we see wetter conditions that stretch all the way through the Great Lakes into New England. So that's very consistent with what we talked about at the beginning. Let's talk temperatures now. So far, the month of October has been very cold east. Some places here on and along the Appalachian Mountains and east and south of there are having a top 5 coldest October, while even though the patterns changed lately, we still have had so much warmth that despite even the colder day that's here now, it didn't outdo what had already happened in the beginning of the month. The temperatures, take a look. Here's today's highs. We've already seen these. The colder air continues to push east on Tuesday. And by Wednesday, it's mainly confined right along the East Coast. So we've returned back toward normal with a cooler bias in the midsection of the country, but we're quite cold throughout the Great Basin here. That's Thursday. Now, getting into Friday and Saturday, there could be some moderation north of the temperatures, and same thing there for Sunday. But you're going to see that overall the temperature pattern will mimic the height pattern. Troughs here, ridges there. Here's a 5-day sliding window of temperatures going forward. And what we just see is that going out into the beginning of November, through the first week of November, and starting the second week, because the jet stream is unblocked, favoring troughs off the west coast, we just tend to see cooler conditions here, with more warm days than cold days in the midsection of the country and east. That's all that means. From there, look at South America today. As we were looking at the satellite imagery, the monsoon is very healthy in this area. That's what you see in all that convection popping there. But there's a hard divide. See it right here where things are much drier into southern Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina. And you know we've been having a lot of discussion about the issues there. Well, when we look out over the next 10 days, the moisture that's going to try to get through Buenos Aires province here toward Cordoba, that's coming tomorrow and the next day. Outside of that, much of the rest of Argentina along the Paraná River, Uruguay, Rio Grande do Sul, they stay drier. And that's our main drought concern area. There's better moisture in Paraná, Mato Grosso do Sul, over toward Minas Gerais. Even Goiás and parts of Mato Grosso are still doing quite well on moisture. And the early season arrival of this moisture has helped push Mato Grosso along with planting. Now, this was released last Friday, but we see that currently they're about 67% planted in Mato Grosso. Last year was almost 69%. The 5-year average is 42%. That's what early season moisture does. So this crop's going in very quickly. The longer range forecast again doubled down on the same pattern it had been seeing, which is drier risks in southern Brazil and Argentina, parts of Paraguay and Uruguay, with wetter north. That is typical of MJO Phase 6-7. That's typical of what La Niña is doing right now. And so this will be a critical thing to be watching going forward with South America, because this is a rough start south and a great start to the north. From there, I'm sure you've heard a lot lately, and we've been covering it in our videos about the flooding in Australia. The month-to-date precipitation map here shows that we have significant portions of South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland that are looking at 100 to over a 200 millimeter difference. So just remember, about 100 millimeters is worth about 4 inches of rain. So we're talking in some places that they've had an excess this month of 4 to 8 inches of rainfall. And we're at the point where the flooding is serious. And a major problem overall. And the forecast, let's do this quickly here, continues to show more moisture coming into that area. So you can see systems continuing to roll through and adding up here, just putting down more right on the headwaters of some of the biggest rivers, like the Darling and the Murray. Okay, so this is going to continue to be a flood issue going forward. And actually, Tasmania is getting quite wet. That's down here. And take a look at New Zealand, very wet on the windward side of the island here. Okay, I wanted to give you that international perspective today with Europe, also South America, and now Australia. But I hope you see some of the bigger things I'm watching for the United States and our drought outlook for not just now, but for the next several months. So I'll keep watching it. I'll report back to you again later this week. Until then, enjoy the rest of the week. Thanks.